Hey there and welcome back. This is our second part of the Customizing the Payload Admin Panel series. And today we're going above just adding our own logo and colors. And we're actually going to add our own custom components into the admin panel, which is not as hard as you might think. Now, before we start, just a little bit of theory. We can say that in general, we have kind of three component types. The first one would be a custom field, which pretty much replaces a specific field inside of our document editor. So if we create a new page, for example, we click on edit that page and we have our input fields in there, we can either add a custom field or just replace one of the input fields with our custom React logic. We also have something called a custom cell. And that is the same thing, but the cell is displayed in our table, so in our list of documents inside of a collection. The third part that we have is default UI extensions or replacements. And that means that inside of the admin panel, we can customize and replace pretty much every single part. We can customize our sidebar. We can customize our dashboard or replace it completely. We can add custom components above the dashboard or below the dashboard, above our table list, below our table list, pretty much everywhere. Now, there's something new in version 3. Since version 3 is now Next.js based, we have the benefit that we can use either a server component or a client component, or we can combine them both. Now, if you might be wondering, what is the difference here? So a server component is rendered on the server, and therefore it can use the payload local API to fetch data before it even renders. So we don't have to use any state, we don't have to do any fetch calls, we don't have to add any loading state, because before the component is rendered and displayed on the client side, it already has that data. Now, client components are the classic way of doing React components, and they are still required for anything that needs reactiveness. So for example, if you want to store specific states or you want to have buttons with certain actions, you will likely need a client component. The cool part is you can combine them both, which means you can embed into the Payload Admin Panel, you can embed a server component that fetches a little bit of data and then passes that data down to the client component, where you can then have your custom buttons, select fields, pretty much anything that you want. Now, the question is, how do we import those custom components? And this is something where you have to watch out, because we do not import components directly into the payload config anymore. This used to be the case in version 2, but since then we've switched to just specifying the path to the component as a string, because Payload now optimizes and removes unnecessary imports. So if we want to import a component, we have two options. The first option is very straightforward and simple. We can just pass it the path to the component as a string. And if we have a default export in that file, we don't need the second part here. But if we don't have a default export, if we have a so-called named export, we need to put it after a hash and then put in our component name. Now, the second option is a little bit more sophisticated. We can, again, specify a path, and we can also specify the export name. So instead of the hash, we can just add the property export name. But Payload also allows us to either give the component custom server props, if it's a server component, or client props if you directly import the component, which is a client component. So if we wrap our client component inside a server component and import that server component into the payload config, we still want to use server props, but Payload also supports directly importing those use client files that are client components. Now, what are we going to do today in practice? First, we're going to create a custom welcome text component that just shows us some very simple stats. And I'm just going to walk you through all the props and attributes that you can access inside of a server component. Now, in addition to that, we're also going to create a custom cell that will display nested address data. I'm going to explain what that is exactly later. And the third thing that we're going to do is we're going to create a custom field, which is client-side, that generates a label in real time. So let's dive straight into it. I'm currently in our code base from the last video. If you haven't watched that, I will link it somewhere, either at the top or in the description below. And if we check out our admin panel here, we can see we have our own custom logo and custom colors. Now, before we add our first custom component, what we're going to do is create an additional collection. So I'm going into collections and I'm naming them companies. So we are planning to store companies inside of Payload. I'm going to say export const companies and type it as a collection config. I have to give it a slug, which will be companies, and we'll just give it the minimal required attributes. Every company should have we can probably leave it like that, a name, a logo we can upload that will be uploaded to our media collection, a short description. We can put this as rich text just for later, and also a website. Another thing that I want to add is an address. Now I'm going to call this address, and this will be a group. And in this group, I'm going to store the street. So name street, which is text and required. The rest got auto-filled. We have our city, we have state, we have zip code, and we have country. I'm going to make it a little bit simpler. I'm just going to remove the country and the state, and I will move the zip code above the city because that's how we do it in Germany, at least. I'm going to put zip code and city into one row. So I'm going to say type row and specify fields. And this will just put the zip code and the city inside of the same line. Now let's go back to our payload config, add companies here. And if we check back into our admin panel, it now shows us the companies collection. We can create a new company, give it a name, test company. Logo is required right now. I don't want that, so I'm just going back and I'm going to make the logo optional. Same as for description and website. We don't really need that. We can leave the address as required. So here, test company. I'm just going to put in an address, test street 27, zip code is 12345, test city. I'm going to click on save, and we successfully created our first company. So let's start adding our custom components. For that, I'm going back into my dashboard, and at the top here, we want to display not just the collections, but at the top we want to add a custom welcoming message to the user that just says, hey, welcome back, username. And it should display us how many companies we have stored. To have that custom welcome message, I need the user to store a name. So I'm going back into my user's config, and I'm just going to store a name attribute, which will just be type text. We can make it required so that every user has a name. So I'm going to call this Sandro from All About Payload. I'm going to click on Save. Now, whenever you want to add something custom into the admin panel, I really recommend going to the official Payload documentation and just reading through it, because it will give you all possible options that you have to customize the Payload Admin Panel. Like I said, if we check back here, we can pretty much do anything. We can replace the sidebar. We can completely replace the dashboard, have something above the dashboard, below the dashboard. We can place something in the header. We can also, so those are custom cells here. We can also have custom fields here. We can have something above the list. We can have something between the search bar and the table. We can have something below the table. Pretty much endless options. So if you read through this, you will get a better understanding anyway. So here we can see after dashboard, after login, after nav links, before dashboard, before login. The list goes on and on. What we are going to focus on for now is the before dashboard option. So the only thing we need to do is in our payload config, in the admin property, we have to specify components before dashboard and then provide our custom component. So let's go back into our code base. I'm going to, in our components file, we have our payload components. We can pretty much just leave that as it is. I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to call it welcome message.tsx. I'm just going to specify a default server component, and I'm going to leave it as it is and import it into payload. So I'm going back in payload config under admin components. If we check back in the documentation components before dashboard, and this is, and you have to watch out, this is actually an array because you can specify multiple components that are rendered below each other. So I'm going back here before dashboard. TypeScript does help there. And now I'm just specifying the path to my component. So I'm saying /components. So here /payload, which is actually not correct. /welcome message. I have to remove the payload one. All right. If we go back and into our dashboard, we now see our welcome message here. Before we adjust this component further, let's quickly go through what props you actually receive in such a server component. If you want to get an overview of those, you can go back here in VS Code. I'm just going to specify the props here. I'm going to console log object.keys and then props. This will just give me an array of all the keys that are available in the props object. So as you can see here, those are the attributes that we get. The first one is I18 Next, that is related to the current local and internationalization in the admin dashboard. We're going to ignore this for now. We also have params and search params, which is basically just the default Next.js props that a component receives. We also have permissions, which we haven't, covered yet. So the two things that we're going to focus on here is the payload object and the user object. Now the payload object is pretty cool because we can just pretty much do anything with it. We can read from the config, we can fetch data using the local API, anything. We're going to use that in a second. More importantly, what we can also use is the user object. So in addition to that, I'm just going to say console log props.user. And let's check what data we have available here. And as you can see, we get a full object of the user data from the user that is currently logged in. So we can see my name here. We can even see my login attempts. We can see my authentication strategy and my email. If we would have more fields there, we would be able to display more fields. Now, this is pretty cool because we can use this straight away. So I'm going to destructure it here in my custom component. And instead of returning welcome message, I'm going to return, we can take that. I will say welcome back username. And we can get rid of that. Now, obviously, what I have to add is types. So interface user. No, I'm going to call it interface welcome message props. I'm going to specify user in there. I'm going to use the payload user type. I'm going to type the welcome message props, and that's it. So I'm going to say welcome back username. All right, so let's check back. And now we get a nice welcome back message. What is missing here is I want to see how many companies I have stored. So in order to add this, what we're going to do is we're going to turn this into an async function first, because otherwise we can't fetch data. And now we can say const payload. Sorry, we don't even need to do that. We can just destructure it here, payload. So I'm going to say const companies equals await payload dot. And we can do either find. What we can also actually do is if we just need the amount of companies, we can do payload dot count. We can specify the collection companies and set the limit to 0. I don't know if that is even required for the count part. So companies, and we can now add a paragraph. You have stored, I can access those companies dot total docs companies. So let's check back if that works. You've stored 1 companies. Obviously that doesn't really make any sense grammatically. So we can do companies dot total docs larger than 1 and then return IES, and if not, return a Y. So you've stored 1 company. Let's quickly test this by creating a new one. So test company 2, test street 22, zip code 00112, Mumbai. I don't know. So let's go back. And as you can see, the server component, even though it's on the server, it gets regenerated every time we open this page up. So it's always up to date. Before we continue, let's quickly fix our type issue that we have here. So to our interface, I need to add payload. I can type it as payload from payload. And right now we're getting the type companies is not assignable to collection slug. And that probably occurs because we haven't regenerated the types here. So in order to do this, we just have to run pmem payload generate types. And this will regenerate all new types. So for example, if you add a new collection, the types need to be regenerated because otherwise they won't be in that payload object. Now, VS Code is still showing us some error here, and that is likely because VS Code is sometimes a bit weird and delays this and still shows an error, even if there's no error left. So we're going to ignore this for now and continue with our custom cell. So first, why do we even want to use a custom cell? Let me show you the issue. I'm going into our companies list, and under columns, I'm activating the address column. I'm also going to move it over here, and we can remove the logo. This doesn't look good. And that's because our address data is actually nested under our address object or group field. And therefore it's just shown as this ugly JSON type thing. Now let's fix this. In order to do this, I'm going back into my code base, and we can create cells, for example here, and I'm going to call it address cell.tsx. In here, again, I'm just creating a boilerplate React functional component here, and let's just log the props again and see what we've got. In order for this to be shown, we have to go into our companies, and we have to specify or go to the address field. And below that, I'm going to say admin components. and I'm going to say cell, and now do components, cells, address cell. So let's wait until this refreshes, maybe show this once. As you can see now, the address is empty, which means our custom cell is loading. And it doesn't log it here. It might just log it in our actual browser. Okay, so what it currently says is it doesn't find it in the import map. And that is what I was talking about previously. Payload kind of kicks out everything that is unnecessary. So if we add a new custom component, what might happen is we need to run pnpm payload generate import map. This will generate all necessary import, although it says it already generated those. So let's npm run dev. Go and refresh this one. Yeah, so now it's an address cell, and here we get our logs. They should also be in our console. So what do we get here? We get cell data, we get collection slug field, row data, link, collection config, IAT next, and payload. Some of them we already know. The important two here are cell data and row data. Cell data is the exact data that the cell has, so everything inside the address field basically. And row data is the data of the entire row in this case, so the entire document. Now to keep things simple, what we just have to do here is we have to do cell data, destructure it here. And instead of returning the address cell, we just need to can put them below each other. We can just do cell data.street, cell data.zip, and cell data.city. So let's check back, and voila, here we have our address data displayed correctly. Now, this is by far not the only thing that you can do with those custom cells. It's pretty much as simple as it can get. So what I'm going to show you in addition to that is I want to be able to click on this address and open it up in Google Maps. So let's go back here. First of all, I have to type my props here. What Payload luckily provides us with is something called default server cell component props that will type all props that we get here. So what I want to do is I'm going to say const address. I'm just going to create a template literal. I'm going to say street, zip, and city. And I'm going to generate a Google Maps URL link from that, which is pretty much just a search with the query, which is the address, but encoded so that it can fit in a URL. And what we can do now is we can turn this div into a link, actually. Give it the href here. We can also say target blank. This will open it up in a new tab. So let's go back here and check if that works. We can just click on it, and yeah, it probably won't find anything here, but let's just look for an address that actually exists. So let's maybe go to New York and find something in Manhattan. Let's just take this cute looking museum and just copy it and add a company here. So Dement Museum, and I just have to find out the address. So we left out the United States, but we have the zip code here, city, New York, and we have to remove that here. Click on save. If we check our custom cell here, we land in this address here, and this should be the museum. It doesn't display as the museum here because we didn't look for the place specifically, but just the address. But as you can see, it works. So like I said, this is just a very simple example of how you can implement such custom cells. Since it's just a custom React component in the end, you can pretty much do anything you want. Last but not least, we're going to implement a custom field component on the client side that generates something that I like to call a label. Now, why do we need such a label? To demonstrate this, what I'm going to do first is add a new field. So in our users, I'm going to create a company field, company, which is type relationship, relation to companies. Now it's still showing me the type error, but like I said, we did everything we can. I just probably have to restart VS Code for that. So let's link, or let's try to link a company in our user. To do this, I'm going into my user and I want to select a company. Okay, now which company do I have to select? I have no idea, because the ID is the primary label by default. To change this, I can go back into my code base, and in companies, I can specify the admin prop, use as title. And I can say, sorry, I just want to say name. Now, instead of the ID, it should now show me, when it reloads, it should now show me the name. Perfect. Now for this simple example, the name is enough. But what happens if we don't just want to show a single field here? So not just a name field, but we also want the name and the city, for example. Because in some cases, the name or one single field might not be a unique identifier for what you are trying to link. So in our case, what we are trying to do is we want to use the name field as the label, and we want to use the address.city. The issue is we can't just use an array here and that will generate the label automatically. We have to do this ourselves. The first option that you can do is you can have an after change hook that automatically, or sorry, before change hook, that is even better, that takes in both of those, both name and the city, and he fills just a label field automatically and stores it in the database. The problem with that is it's not real time. So as you can see, if I use the name as a label, or sorry, let me go back here and quickly change the user as title to label, because that's what we want to use as the title. So if I go back here in my companies and I edit my name, I want this to show up here in the title, but it doesn't. So that's why we're going to use a custom client component. To do this, I'm going back, I'm creating a new component, and I'm calling it generate company label. This component has to be a client component because we need to do some things on the client side. So I'm using use client. I'm going to show you one very cool hook that we can use. So we can do const value set value equals use field. This is a function that Payload provides us with, and we need to import this use field. I don't know why it doesn't auto import, to be honest, from at Payload CMS UI. And that's probably the case. We get type issues if we don't install this library separately. So I have to install payload cms./UI. It will still work without importing the library, but we won't get rid of the type errors, and we need it for auto import. So what can I do with this? I can't just specify use field. I have to give it a path, and the path will be label. Now what I can do with this is I can now set the value label whenever I want. So I can return this generate company label thing here. In our case, we don't actually need to return anything because it should be a hidden field. So the way that we use this, to be honest, this doesn't do anything right now, but I wanted to import it straight away. The way that we use is in companies, I will add a new field. So name, we can give it generate label, and the type will be a UI component. That means it doesn't create any new field in the company schema. It's just there to be able to import those custom components. So I'm going to say components and field. And there I'm going to import my component / generate company label field. So back in here, what I have to do is I also have to grab the values of our name field and our city field. There are multiple ways to do this. To stick with this useField, just because it's simple, I'm just going to have two other ones. And I actually don't need the value of the labels. I just need to be able to set the value. So I'm going to have two other ones, value, and I'm labeling it company name, and that equals useField with path name. And I also have value company city, and that will use the path address.city. Now the missing piece is a use effect, and again we can only use this because it is a client component. So I can say set value, and I'm just going to set it to the company name, and then there's a dash. I like to do it this way, and a company city. Now if that is not defined, I will just put it as an empty string. I will also put trim at the end so that we don't have any unnecessary white space. For the company name, I'm just going to do the same. So this should be it. And if we go back into our admin panel, whoops, we might have to refresh this one. So here we go. Now let me just update our name here, and it magically automatically generates this label. As you can see, the label field is still visible. We can keep it visible, or if we want to hide it and just, see it at the top, we can go back here, and under companies label, we can say admin hidden true. That should hide the field completely. Okay, now we can just see it here. Now, like I said, the cool part about that is as soon as we change something here, so we can say Los Angeles, it will update it in real time at the top here. Just going to change it back, click on save, and yeah, that is pretty much how we can use a custom field component here. Obviously, the same thing is true for custom field components. If we just want to show something here, instead of just returning nothing, we can return a div, say hello world. And again, this is here. We can pretty much display and do anything that we want. So this will be it for our overview about custom components in the Payload Admin Panel. If you need more context or want to know where exactly you can add those custom components, again, I will link the payload documentation down below. Also, if you have any specific use cases or specific custom components that you would like us to talk about or that we should build in a video, please write us a comment down below. And apart from that, take care and see you in the next video.